It's a pleasure to welcome to SDP Talks writer, broadcaster, director of the Academy of Ideas, and former European parliamentarian, Claire Fox. Welcome.
It's great to be talking to you.
There's so much to talk about now, and I'd like to kick off with free speech, which I know is a massive issue currently. And if I can, I'd like to start off with a quote. John Gray wrote recently, "Today we are no longer living in a free society. Instead, we are ruled by those who try and enforce their extreme views by shaming and ruining those who think differently." Do you think he's right?
I don't know. The word extreme I feel uncomfortable with, but I think the rest of it is completely spot on. It feels to me as though the moment is not just a free speech crisis. I mean, we kind of knew already that there was an atmosphere of no platforming people. I don't just mean at universities, but there was an increasing tendency to say that you can't say that. You know, that's unacceptable. I find that offensive. Or people saying, you know, that's creating trauma when I hear you say that. Words were given and imputed with the ability to harm us. And so we were already struggling with an increasingly censorious atmosphere. Now, I think this phrase cancel culture, which is not entirely satisfactory, but that phrase has come to mean more than that, which is that if you misspeak in some way, if you say something that goes against an ever narrower, prescriptive, acceptable opinion on a number of issues, there is an attempt to destroy your credibility, to delegitimize you by this kind of public shaming. I heard somebody the other night say, well, you know, nobody's lost their job in UK media over this, you know, why is everybody whinging? I mean, that was effectively it. But the fact that you'd even want somebody to have their reputation destroyed, and I think that even if you don't lose your job, the idea that you can be written off as a fascist apologist, as alt-right, as a racist, as a bigot, as a xenophobe, as a transphobe, all of these phrases we're now so familiar with because they're bandied around a huge amount. You know, the idea that, all right, well, you can keep your job, but your reputation is utterly trashed in the public square.
Yeah.
This seems to me to be different than just saying you're not allowed to say that. It's gone further. It's more malicious, more toxic.
Yeah, I mean, there's more to it anyway. I mean, the fact that no one's lost their job isn't the end of the story, because, of course, the pressure on people to toe the line, to say the right thing, distorts what they say, doesn't it? So, I mean, it's already doing that job for it. I mean, the pressure put on journalists to be very careful what they say, and other people in institutions, is everywhere. So that's, I mean, in a sense, it's not so much that no one's lost their job, it's look at what they're actually having to say, or rather not say. Yeah.
Somebody, you know, I know it can't be made public because, and that's what this atmosphere is like, but somebody I know who works in a public service has recently been formally disciplined for writing a letter that they didn't make public, but simply writing a letter in response to a demand for support for Black Lives Matters and unconscious bias training and so on, wrote a letter objecting and was disciplined for it. The thing that then has occurred in relation to this is that the people that this person works with know that story.
Yeah.
An example is made. You know, HR are called in and so on. So I think that what we've got, and this is one of many stories. I mean, there are people who've lost their jobs, but it's a climate, an atmosphere in which you know that potentially your employment is at stake. Potentially you are told that there is a correct answer. And if you don't give the correct answer, that you can be cast off and cast out of polite society. So I think there's enormous pressure to self-censor. Yeah. And or speak in bad faith, which is even worse, isn't it? Where you kind of like nod along, knowing you don't believe a word of it.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a little piece for Spiked last week, which went pretty well, and it was comparing where we are now to the Iron Curtain. I visited Poland. I had a friend went there, and just after martial law, and they basically had three species of truth. You know, the Pravda truth, public truth, which was completely false. Everyone was. And then they had workplace truth, which is what you describe, actually. Everyone was very, very careful what they said at work. They couldn't speak out. Workplace truth was a little bit closer to truth than Pravda truth, but then there was truth at home, which was the only truth they could rely on. And what I've found odd is the speed. I mean, we in Britain, we think we've got a sort of high level of embedded rights. You know, the sort of Englishman's right to speak, free speech in the pub and so on. And we think we've got that. But then all of a sudden, the conditions are right for a movement from the States. We've imported some of this stuff. And all of a sudden, all the institutions, like ducks in a row, have actually, just fallen down and are all saying the same thing, which would be a miracle if they really thought the same thing. So I don't know what's your reaction to that?
Well, it's like a meme rather than something that people have been completely convinced of. So every institution knows that in order to put themselves on the right side of history, as it's often described, that they must be seen to sign up to this agenda. The reason why it's happened with such speed is because those people, those of us who have been arguing that there's a free speech crisis for the last decade, have been dismissed, generally told that this was confined to student radicals, that we shouldn't worry about it. And also there's a generational problem, which is that it's posited as though the young people of today are particularly sensitive to the insights of oppression. They are far more in tune with defending people who are oppressed, and that something about being older makes you, kind of unable to see the bigotry around you and so on.
Yeah.
And there's a real defensiveness there. So, immediately anyone who argues for a principled position on free speech can be dismissed as an old fogey, somebody who's, old-fashioned, out of date, not in touch. Now, the thing about this is that this is a generalization in all levels. Not all young people feel the same.
Yeah.
But the spokespeople of the youth are almost used to ventriloquize a set of ideas. But it does make institutions feel defensive, because inevitably institutions and organizations are run by slightly older people who've worked their way up the chain. That's the way it goes, right? The 18-year-old is not the CEO. So the CEO suddenly thinks, oh my God, I'm in my 50s. Maybe I'm not in tune. I don't want the young to think I'm not like that, and so on and so forth. So you've got a combination of those things. But I do think the fact that we haven't intellectually argued the case for free speech, I don't mean individuals haven't, but there hasn't been a real pushback against an encroachment on the freedom to speak freely, to think freely even, means that in a way everything's fallen like skittles. They're kicking at an open door.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think certainly yourself and Mick Hume and everyone else has been arguing on this. You can see the very, very long tail of it. And I'd argue that you wouldn't have got here in a couple of months. We didn't just suddenly arrive here. This is a very long tail. And if you look at some of the polling evidence on respect for democracy, respect for free speech, it's actually been in decline, quite serious decline. Respect for democracy has. It's quite alarming. And maybe you do feel quite old-fashioned defending it. Some people think it's not very, it's not that important. But I think the giving way of people, possibly of our generation, in institutions is a terribly mistaken thing, and it's governed by fear. And what you worry about is that Brett Weinstein's right in saying that basically what happened at Evergreen State College, where the leadership of the college just gave in completely, and then it got worse. And the more they gave in, the worse it got. And then that basically a slow motion has happened in every institution that we've got.
But it's also the case that, on the giving in, I mean, the Evergreen College example which if people aren't familiar, they should become familiar with. But I remember talking about that, slightly obsessively as it was happening in real time. And people thinking it was, again, an outlier, an exception. But you could see, when I wrote, I find that offensive. That was, I can't remember, 4 years ago or 5 years ago, whenever it was, 4 years ago. It was as though I was, people sort of said, oh, you're talking about all these things in America, they won't happen here. Whereas I could see all the trends happening here. And again, it was dismissed as, when you said about extremes, it was dismissed as this is the extreme. But actually, I could see it was the mainstream. But in terms of the kind of supine behaviour of people in authority, the bit that's confusing, and by the way, I don't know the answer to this entirely, but say, for example, something like Oxford University, where you have the dispute about the Rhodes statue, Rhodes must fall, where it started in a way, the statue toppling, or in the UK, that was what we were familiar with. But what we've also got to remember is that intellectually, the academic world has been riven by post-structuralism, postmodernism, anti-colonial critical race theory for many years. So there is an intellectual cohort that have been attacking the basis of Western liberalism, the Enlightenment, the philosophers of the Enlightenment have developed an academic worldview that has already been eating away at. So in many ways, the students are lobbying a group of academics who already believe that these institutions are rotten at the core, Western institutions. So it's a combination of some of them being fearful and lots of them actually believing it. That they themselves can't defend something like history, for example. They don't know how to deal with a situation where history is under attack. Now, I don't mean defend Cecil Rhodes. I don't even mean defend the statue. It's just that whatever the lightning point is, there's already a sort of great degree of disillusionment with what one has historically known as Western civilization.
There's certainly, you're right, that there is a huge intellectual hinterland in the academy to support all this, and they've produced people that have been educated into this way of thinking, and then they've gone into this institutions. What I'm interested in is that by way of a solution, is that that's true, but it's also clear, a bit like the Brexit situation, that there's a misalignment between those at the top of the institutions, people running the BBC, for instance, and what I would call just the mainstream opinion of British citizens. And I think there's an opportunity there for those of us who have identified that to speak up, actually, for what is probably a majority. And at the end of the Spike piece, I was thinking, I always try and think about solutions, and sometimes it's easier to describe problems, isn't it? This is the problem, that's the problem. You can get that right, but the bit of having a solution or having something productive is a lot harder. But I just said, well, at the end of it, the solution is to take the freedom to speak freely. The problem I have with that is that I understand that, our small, political parties, Social Democrats, we're not bound by the sort of constraints that some others are. And as an individual, I'm free to say what I like. But you're right that a lot of people who depend, and have got a mortgage to pay and bills to pay, do not have that freedom. But I think there is someone somewhere has got to speak up for the majority, surely.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't suggest that this the takeover of the institutions or that institutional acceptance of these ideas means that they have got widespread popularity. I simply mean that that's been going on for some time.
Yeah.
And it's both at the top, middle and bottom of institutions. But nonetheless, for millions and millions of people, and probably the majority, this is something that they didn't even know was being discussed. It's been discussed. There's been changes to the way people understand things behind the backs of. So that's why you can understand, if you're au fait with the statue toppling, but if you haven't been following it carefully, you think, what do you mean you're taking down that statue, or decolonize that, or the past is this, or they would be bemused. So of course it's important to give leadership. I mean, I want everybody to speak out, but I just am sensitive to the fact that I don't want everyone to lose their jobs. No. So I know, therefore, there needs to be leadership. But your other point that you said about the Soviet, the Eastern Bloc and that atmosphere is really well made, because it does seem to me that the people don't stop thinking. They don't. So people are talking, but they'll be whispering, and it will go elsewhere. And in some ways it can then fester and it can be corrupted. And there's no doubt then that there's dangers involved in not being able to speak freely, not being able to ask questions, query things, or people being forced into binary positions. So you think, well, if that means that, then I must be on the other side, when in fact you might not be on the other side. It's just a bit more complicated. And so I actually think we have an obligation, those of us who are free and not going to be sacked, even if there's attempts to cancel us, to give a lead and say, actually, you don't need to go from one extreme to another. You don't have to go, I'm not supporting Black Lives Matters, therefore I'm going to emphasize that white lives matters at the expense of black, and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm caricaturing it, but that kind of thing. You don't have to go into a situation where you say, I don't like the attacks on, the decolonizer curriculum, because I think the empire was brilliant and everybody had a wonderful time under colonialism, because that would be untrue and it's not right. So I think, therefore, if you can create an open discussion, it allows people to realize they don't have to go to either side of that, and that's very important to me.
Now you mentioned the word dangers there, and to move on, I think obviously the impact of the BLM movement in the UK and elsewhere through the West, interestingly, particularly the Anglo or the sort of what has been described as the North Sea Protestant West. Because an interesting factor about BLM and the impact of the Cultural Revolution that's happening is that below the olive line, it's not quite the same. That's just an interesting observation. But so we appear to have imported Americanized sort of hyper-racial politics overnight. But as you say, I don't think these things can happen overnight, but we appear to have done so. And so I want to ask you, how significant a cultural moment do you think this is? Do you think it's transitory? Do you think, after the lockdown finishes, everything goes back to normal? Or do you think there's a sort of secular major change going on here, which we should think about?
I think there's a major fight about to happen. I think that it certainly won't go back. The trends towards identity politics, which is, of course, another thing which has been happening apace over a period of time, and somebody like the writer Ben Cobley wrote a book on it. I mean, lots of people have tried to alert us to the problems of identity politics, which are so divisive. I think that this cultural moment cements them and makes them very difficult to argue against and makes them more unassailable. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't. It also, by the way, brings them into focus, because, if before we were saying that, a lot of people were in denial about the free speech crisis, a lot of people also just didn't know that there would be this argument over statues or identity, or whether we judge people, for example, by their character or their skin color, or how we defined gender and so on. These kind of debates were almost kind of like a group of people involved in the culture wars, but on the margins, of people like me alerting people, other people are arguing against me. This is now in a way being opened up to the public because of lockdown, maybe, or because of this Black Lives Matters moment, which means that it doesn't matter where you go in the country, people will have a view on it, right? Everybody, to a certain extent, is now being exposed to some of this discussion. And whereas I don't necessarily like the way some directions it goes in, at least it means that that conversation has inadvertently been opened up. So at the very time that there are people saying you can't have the conversation, they've also demanded that every single person in this country goes along with, you know, Robin DiAngelo's white fragility.
Yeah.
And suddenly everyone's like, oh, what's that then? And they start talking about it. Well, what is white privilege? And that gives you an opportunity, I think, a positive opportunity to say, let's have this conversation then. I'm not frightened of it. Let's have it in the out. And so I don't think what I'm saying is I don't think there's going back from that, but there's also an intellectual battle, and it won't go away unless that intellectual battle is had out.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I think we should relish a debate about it. And I think in particular, the actual political program that BLM, the official BLM have published, should be scrutinized and debated more. And I've been disappointed to see that the media has skirted over that and taken really cherry-picked what they wanted to see, the sort of nice bits, but ignored some of the really hard, anti-family, but very radical stuff, which should have been judged on a par with any other political movement, and it hasn't been. It's interesting that it hasn't been. But I think the central premise that you can somehow get progress or bring people together by emphasizing their differences and hammering those differences is false. I think it's plainly false. And I think it brings me to the letter that Andrew and Anaya and yourself wrote and published in The Spectator, which I was very happy to sign at the bottom. Don't divide us, is a much better message. I mean, it just, the outcomes of having that attitude towards trying to unite people, it's just so more positive. I said on Twitter the other day, I think actually Don't Divide Us could well be the most important political slogan going forward.
It would be great to think so. I mean, it had more modest an aim, which it was just an attempt to say, look, there's a group of us across the political spectrum, across ages and across ethnicities, and we weren't trying to go for the Harper's 150. We weren't trying to do anything too major, but just to try and say very quickly, we did it very quickly. I mean, we wrote it and we kind of tried to publish it quite quickly, because I could see that this attempt at dividing us in this instance around ethnicity and skin colour was actually going to lead to some quite dangerous trends. Because if you say to a country that's majority white, which, the idea that one has to even be defensive about that, I mean, it just is. The majority of people are white. It's not an achievement. It's not a sin. It's a reality. It's the least interesting part of who we all are, in my opinion.
I totally agree with you.
But that is emphasised, and then you're told that you've done something wrong. I mean, that you are privileged as a consequence of what? You think, what? I never did anything. What? I'm just white. I mean, I never, what?
It's nonsense, Claire. And I mean, the SDP is a very, in the North, certainly, is a very working class party. And I did a little poll when this started coming up in the media about 2 months ago, of members, SDP members around Tyneside, Teesside, Yorkshire particularly, and just to find out what the general view about white privilege as an idea was. And it was rejected instantly. I mean, people had, most of us, most of our ancestors were working in the heavy industries, in coal mining. Many of them lost limbs. And if they didn't lose limbs, they're coughing up coal dust. That's the reality. That's the reality of most people's experience, a generation ago. And I think working class people are very, very quick. I think it's the same as the Brexit thing, actually. Working class people are very, very quick to spot an attempt to use a sort of power thing and hang a label on them. And I think the reason for that is quite often they're at the wrong end of the power game, and they suss it straight away. And I think this time round, some of the best, the quickest cut through has been from people saying, "Don't pin that on me, it's not going to work."
But it's also the case that as a part of this, we have these terrible acronyms like BAME or POC, in which people who are not white, i.e., again, the most superficial aspect of them, their skin colour, are lumped together, and a movement is launched apparently in their name, which obviously is incredibly insulting to their individuality, to so their agency is completely undermined by that, and so white privileges, or white people over here, you have privilege. If you deny it, you're in denial. And then everybody who is BAME, or everyone who's black, or even if you said everyone who's Asian, of course, they don't all think the same things, right? But racism, historically, and this is an important fact because it's in living memory that there was institutionalized racism in this country. That is true. And that there were, in when I say living memory, things have changed, but people were, not employed because of the colour of their skin. They were not, and the usual no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. Those things did happen. And also where there were organised gangs of racists who said deport every black person from this country.
So this is the curious thing.
And it changed dramatically because people fought against it. It doesn't mean everything was eradicated, but it's quite important because there's still a rump of racists in this country. Of course there are, right? Who are racist in the traditional sense. And my concern with Don't Divide Us was, if everybody else doesn't argue against this, that rump of racists will play on the fact that the majority of people in the country who are white are being called racist. And they will play on that, and they will whip up division even further, and they will play on white victimhood and try and kind of create a new movement. And I wanted to try and say, no way, don't divide us.
I think that you're exactly right, and there's a lot in that. So that I think one of the worst aspects of importing American-style hyper-racialism into the UK is that people are encouraged constantly to see the worst and to seek out the worst in their fellow citizens, and never ever to see the more positive side. And John McWhirter, who's a writer I like a lot, and is on Don't Divide Us website, in the links you can have a look. He made a very important point last year before this started up, but he writes on racial politics a lot. Glenn Lowry the same, and Coleman Hughes, excellent. And he made the point that we have made progress. I mean, we have made progress. The 64 Civil Rights Act is a reality. The 68 Act in the States is a reality. On any metric, things have got better. So McWhirter's point is, why? How can it be fashionable to deny that? I mean, it's true. I mean, we don't have utopia. Human beings are flawed. But to deny that there's been any progress seems to be the most fashionable thing in the world. Why?
Well, that's the problem with flattening history and a dehistoricized, ahistorical approach, which is, where you do get, and I mean, we've seen an example of the grime artist Wiley interviewed in The Voice in relation to another controversy around anti-Semitism, but he sort of basically said, I am still suffering the hangovers of slavery because the way I, as a grime artist, am treated by my management and by lawyers. And you do think, do you know what I mean? Wiley, you haven't got a clue what slavery is if you think that there's a direct line from our grime artists. But what you get is this kind of an attempt at plundering history in order to effectively emphasize a victimhood today. With no specificity as to what has changed, what has improved, what has not improved. I mean, of course, that's allowed to. And I think it's a great insult, by the way, to those people who were the anti-racists of the past, the people who fought long and hard to improve civil liberties, equal treatment, fight racism, that basically their work, apparently we're all got to ignore that, right? So apparently they didn't make any difference at all. Because
But they did. This is the thing.
But they did. No, but I'm saying if you go along with what's being said by those people who support a kind of Black Lives Matters moment, even rather than movement, if you basically say racism is as bad as ever today, then what's the point of ever fighting racism, right? I mean, what's the point? basically you've just told us
Yeah.
that it's exactly the same, that nothing has changed since slavery or since colonialism, that you actually are treated and you think, well, first of all, it's not true. So to point that out, just in case anyone doesn't. But even if you were to think it was true, what you would be effectively saying is that all of those anti-racist fighters had wasted their time, and all the changes they made had made no difference. So it seems absolutely the case to me that you have to be precise. And if you say that there's racism in the UK, and undoubtedly in some, there will be pockets of racist people with backward views, there might well be instances, you say what they are, you look at it and you examine it. Now, the difficulty about hyper-racialized discussion is that, in the way that you described that phrase, or if you see everything through the racial prism. So today, when they announced the expulsions from schools, and there's a higher proportion of young black pupils, actually young black boys, who are expelled from schools. Is that because teachers are racist about young black boys, or is it more complicated than that?
It's much more complicated than that.
Exactly. But that's the question, isn't it? All I'm saying is that's what we should. You can't just declare, as they have done on every radio program I've heard all day,
that's right,
that this shows that there's racism. Not necessarily. It might show a range of different things, and therefore I want to look at the specific case, the specific accusation, unpick it, and look at what drove it, what we think about it, and have an open and honest discussion. If, when I say that, not to you, but if I say to somebody, let's talk about this and all the nuance about why that might be the case, I'm immediately assumed to be a racist because I'm not going along with saying it is because of racism. That's when you get the festering of opinions being driven underground and a kind of silencing of intelligent debate.
But the intelligent debate, you've absolutely nailed it there. This is the point. So the Today program covered that for about 7 or 8 minutes this morning. We had 3 interviews. And firstly, I do not believe that the group of people in the London, say take London, for example, I mean, we've got friends that are teachers there. I do not believe that there's a conspiracy among London teachers and London heads to expel people on racial grounds. That is nonsense. You might get behaviors that might vary between different groups, and they might have to react to them. I think anyone trying to widen the discussion about saying, well, what sort of family stability do those kids have at home? How many absent fathers are there? You know, are they getting into trouble because that isn't as stable as it might be? If you immediately try and get a more nuanced look at it, you'll actually, the point usually isn't made. That's the criticism I have it. A more nuanced point. I've listened to so much stuff on the BBC which is just superficial nonsense, and they never get past first base. And the problem with it is they don't realise the consequences of taking a simplistic, racialized view of it. And if they're putting this out, people are thinking, oh God, you know, in inner London, people are expelling black lads because they're black.
Yeah, and but also, what do you do? So this is the dilemma. So I might or might not agree as to what you think might be or might not be why there's a behaviour difference. That's the kind of debate we should be having, by the way.
Yeah.
And also, as you say, I mean, you can say, I don't believe. I mean, it is just not true that there are people are being expelled because they're black. That's not what's happening in modern Britain today.
No.
What is happening, though, is that, and this debate just sums it up. So you have a declaration that young black pupils are expelled because of racism. Yeah. So say you are a teacher and you go back in September, October, and you have a young black pupil who is behaving very badly in a class, and you have a young white pupil who's behaving very badly in the class, and teachers are already nervous about authority and expulsion and removal from school anyway. And if you follow this debate, you are more likely to know that you will find it easier to get it past the head to expel the young white pupil, whereas you might hold back from disciplining or pushing the expulsion of the young black pupil. because
Sure.
you don't want anyone to think you're a racist, i.e., you are treating a young black pupil differently from a young white pupil,
Yeah.
which is what we don't want.
Yeah.
Because if you want everybody to be treated the same, if the behaviors are equally bad, then you want them both to be expelled. You don't want somebody to be sitting there going, oh God, I'm frightened to expel that person in case anybody thinks. And so what I think happens is each time these things are declared as truth rather than let's investigate, you close down yet once more the possibility of treating people equally, because you overemphasize that if you treat one group the same as another group, actually you might be seen to be somehow discriminatory, and therefore you've got to therefore keep well away. And we've seen the consequences of that in social policy over the years for some time, I think. A nervousness by officials to intervene in case they are labelled racist. We all kind of know where that ends.
Famously, we saw that in Rotherham. No, what happens is that if you introduce, this is what I'm most worried about, the particular moment we're in now, is that you introduce an atmosphere of tension and mistrust, and you make everything worse. Anything you're trying to do with social policy, anything you're trying to do with improving things, you make it harder, you make it worse. Claire, can I move on to the final thing I wanted to talk about? So about, when was it? It was about 16 months ago. I was having a glass of wine in London, minding my business with Patrick and Suzanne Evans. And I got invited along to a Leavers of London do. And you were speaking at that event. And I got dragged into speaking, even after 3 glasses of Merlot. I think I got away with it. But a point I tried to make, and I think you made that night, was that it's true that the Brexit, the main Brexit campaigns, Leave campaigns were sort of Thatcherite open market things. But the fact is that 5 million of us voted on the left, us centre left, and some others further to the left. But the left case, I think, to leave the European Union was an incredibly strong one. I still think that. I think there was no point in getting these leavers back from technocrats to give them to other technocrats in the WTO. So it was all about, could you keep a steelworks open? Could you make your own social and economic bargains? Are you free to, you might have some trade friction. Personally, I think that would probably be good. I think in the right areas, you might want to try and get your own wage levels up. Now, all of these things, I think, are impossible without a Lexit, an approach to, national, domestic economic governance. And I just wondered where you feel we are on that, because to some extent it was a sort of first order, second order thing. We said, yes, you've got to leave the European Union, but I never argued for, and I never subscribed to the sort of free market, freewheeling thing. Where do you think we are now on that?
I think probably that most people associate the economic aspects of Brexit more with the free market argument. And there's no doubt about it that some of the most ardent Brexiteers are interested most precisely from a point of view of an economic settlement. But actually, I think the more left-leaning Brexit argument was more about control and democracy.
Yeah.
The reason why that matters is that inadvertently, through the shenanigans that tried to stop Brexit from occurring, people were a bit like trying to make a virtue out of a necessity. But one of the things that happened was there was a greater discussion about the democratic aspects of Brexit after the establishment failed to deliver it.
Yes.
So we had that 3.5 years, ironically, of people then sort of saying, actually, this wasn't an economic thing for me. I was basically saying, I want control. I want my politicians to be accountable to me. And that brought it more into focus. Your point about there was always a left-wing argument for leaving the European Union. It had a big tradition on the left, right? Left-leaning from far left to centre-left, or lots of people thought it. It's
Mm.
just that the left lost their nerve once the referendum was called. They basically panicked and thought that they might be labelled right-wing, that it was and so on and so forth. They panicked about it and they abandoned the field, which meant that although millions of people voted who were on the left for Brexit, the leadership of a left Brexit was absent, to say the least.
I think that's interesting, no, because it's a point I always, in public meetings, David Owen, I asked him a few times what happened to the great tradition of Euroscepticism in the Labour Party, and you think about all the way back to Gateskill and Attlee actually, but more further on from that, Peter Shaw and Barbara Castle and Tony Benn, who I think had the best arguments. I think they sussed it straight away in the 70s. They won the arguments but lost the events, I suppose. But I think it was interesting that the Euroscepticism within the Labour Party seemed to have been just expunged during Tony Blair's sort of New Labour thing, and you look at the number of elected members in the PLP. It was sort of 9 or 10, it was very small. So yeah, I think when it came to it, I mean, it was weird at that meeting in the Leavers meeting that we spoke at in London, because quite a few members of the Communist Party of Great Britain came up to me afterwards and said, thanks for making the argument, because although they're tiny parties, no one else was officially backing it on the left, but SDP and them. And it's interesting. I just wanted to bring it up because events, the pandemic, I think one of the effects of it has been to really undercut the cocksure sort of confidence that free traders had. They've been telling us for 30 years, didn't matter where things were made, doesn't matter. They're indifferent to that. It doesn't really make it anywhere. Gut your industry, undermine your industrial job sector, which in the end undermines society because it undermines family, and everything will be okay. And by the way, it doesn't matter if you're sourcing all your goods from factories from totalitarian states. That doesn't matter either. And I just wonder, Claire, do you think that though the pandemic and the realization that gutting your industry in the West is not a good idea, do you think that's finally getting through?
I think it's certainly brought into sharp relief, and I do think that there will be an economic I think that we're likely to have an economic discussion that has a different shape, both because of Brexit and the pandemic. I mean, a combination of those two things. But I think there's other aspects of it. And actually, it goes back to the first part of your discussion, because one of the reasons why the Labour Party, not just the Labour Party, but why the left panicked about Euroscepticism was because there was an attempt at delegitimising the Leave vote as racist, xenophobic and bigoted. And even though none of those things, so in a way it was cancel culture before it existed as a concept, right? I was not a passionate Eurosceptic. I was Eurosceptic, but it wasn't by any stretch of the imagination my main focus. But I became so incensed in the build up to the referendum that anyone that was on the side of voting Leave was being called alt-right, far-right, anti-immigrant, and so on and so forth, that I started to get more vocal. As we know, once the referendum was won, instead of that meaning that we left the European Union, there was a doubling down of this delegitimization. And it was basically an accusation leveled at the white working class that they were selfish, that they didn't understand internationalism, that they had no understanding of, that they didn't like foreigners. All of these things were said. And what it completely missed was that for once people felt that they were grasping hold of their own agency. And this attempt at labelling them racist and xenophobic and people who didn't have any understanding of international affairs was such a slap in the face and an insult to people that they started to, demonstrate that there was a lot more about them. But the left was so preoccupied with an identity politics version of things that they assumed that pro-EU as an identity, it became a way of identifying yourself. I am going to vote Remain which means I'm a nice person
Oh yeah,
who
yeah.
likes immigrants and agrees with internationalism. And I do think that you and lots of people, I mean, you, lots of us, gave a much richer account of what Brexit was about, really. About a sense of place, about a sense of community, about people wanting to feel that they had some ownership over their future and not to be told that it was out of their hands, that it was too complicated, that we had to leave it up to the technocrats in Brussels. People started to say, no, I want to say. So I think one of the great things about the post-Brexit moment that, as you say, then is brought to the fore by the pandemic, is that you then start to say, okay, well, now we've got to take some responsibility for how we run our society, because we're almost going to start from scratch.
Yeah.
What do we think about our industries? What do we think about the division of labour internationally? How do we feel about being dependent on different countries for, you know, and so on and so forth? So it's a richer conversation. I do get nervous about protectionism. I do get nervous that we will turn inwards. All of these things are things to be nervous about. But that doesn't mean that you should veer away from that conversation. This is exactly the kind of conversation we should be having. What kind of society are we going to build now we have the power? Now, I know we haven't really got the power, but what we have asserted is that we want it.
The range of choices that a UK government now has been expanded dramatically, and it's the pandemic is interesting in that the strong and supportive state has suddenly, you know, all these years people have been saying you can't do anything about housing, can't do anything about public transport, you just can't. Tina, you know, and it's been going on years and years, and then suddenly we find we can. And actually, in a way, that's very liberating. And I'm certainly much more optimistic. I always suspected that, you know, certainly, you know, industrially, the working classes will be let down to some extent by you know, the free trade Singapore on Thames sort of version. I mean, the people that said that didn't even understand what Singapore was, but I always thought they'd be let down. But I think actually the recent events have made me much more optimistic about our vision of a slightly more domestically focused national economy. I'm much more confident about that, and I think that's a good thing. So you never know. I mean, you've got to take silver linings, I think, out of events, and that may be one.
I'd just like to say, just in finishing, that history is made by people who've got courage to stick their head above the parapet. And although I'm not thinking of joining the SDP, I've really admired the fact that you've stuck with it.
Yeah. Because
you have to start and build things. And you made a point at the beginning. I think this is just so important in this period that we're entering into, that too often it's easy to stand on the sidelines and criticize. It's not always easy to build. And I think that we're now in a juncture where it's obvious that history is unraveling.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to fight for, and therefore it does require that people get stuck in. So I just wanted to say to you, I've got a lot of admiration for the work that you're doing.
You're very kind. And I just think at every level that's true, Claire. I think it's not, I mean, what we're trying to do, I think, is important, but I think at every level, you know, whether it's turning up on your school council or your local council or to a committee, just show up. For heaven's sake, show up. Because if you don't show up, things happen and you think, how did we get here? And partly was because people didn't show up. We'll finish up there, Claire. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to chat these things through. Take care.